Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. So, as Marv said, there we go. As Marv said, please continue enjoying your lunch. Anybody who does public speaking has learned how to speak over the sound of eating and drinking. So please continue to enjoy your lunch. But we're going to go ahead and get started because we have been trying for 2 years to get Kim Strassel here. And so we have waited long enough. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. Isn't it great to be back to doing in-person events again? We are so delighted that you've all come out and joined us. You've probably been going as stir-crazy as we have been going. I think over the course of the pandemic, we did about 38 Zoom policy events. And while we're grateful for that technology that allowed us to keep doing what we do, there is nothing like getting together with people in person and enjoying good fellowship and camaraderie over food and drink. So thank you so much for coming. As Marv also mentioned, these luncheons are sponsored with a very generous grant from the Sumners Foundation here in Dallas. We've been working with the Sumners Foundation for a number of years on these. The Sumners Foundation is a real treasure here in Dallas. They sponsor an enormous number of college scholarships for students in the Texas and Oklahoma area. And the mission of the Sumners Foundation is to make sure these young students get all of the material they need so that they can be good, engaged, functioning citizens as adults. And for those of us who work in this area, for those of us who work in policy and politics, it's one thing to try to persuade folks of our own age, but we will all be passing off the scene before we know it. And so really what we should be focusing on is the next generation, and the Sumners Foundation does that. So it's a wonderful organization with a noble mission, and those of you who are board members with the foundation, we want you to know how much we appreciate what you do and how much we respect the organization. We do a private session after the lunch with the Sumners scholars who are here. And so we ask that you not swarm the stage when Kim is finished, because Kim needs to get to that meeting and spend some private time with the Sumner scholars. That's a very special thing that we do. It's a wonderful opportunity for these college students to get alone in the room with our speakers and get to ask them all sorts of questions about not just policy, but career. You know, what path took you here? How did you end up where you ended up? That's great information for these young people. So it's a very important part of what we do, and we're delighted that they're here. We also have a large group from Founders Classical Academy in Louisville. Where are our Founders students? Thank you. We're delighted you could be here. Founders is the classical charter school that my son graduated from, and so I have sort of a fond and emotional relationship with that school. That's another part of this next generation stuff, right? Is teaching young students the classics. They teach Latin at Founders. They teach the virtues. They make them read Plato and Aristotle at the high school level. That's how we restore Western civilization, folks. That's how we do it. And so Founders does a wonderful job. If you don't know about Founders, it's a whole chain in Texas. There are 7 or 8 Founders Classical Academies throughout Texas. One of my board members, Wayne Stoltenberg, has been on the board of a classical charter school in Westlake. And so this is a very exciting movement. And maybe one of these days we'll do a Sumners event on classical education and how important that is. It just dawns on me that might be a great idea for us to do. If you don't know anything about the Institute for Policy Innovation, we are a 34-year-old free market think tank here in Dallas. We focus on issues of liberty. We care about economic liberty. We care about individual liberty. We care about the Constitution. And as long as everybody's operating within the 4 walls of the Constitution, we're okay with that. We're simpatico with that. Where we get concerned is when people start operating outside the 4 walls of the Constitution. And our speaker today has been hitting that topic pretty hard for the last few years. You know, there are a handful of columnists that for me are must read, and it's a small handful. But Kim Strassel's Potomac Watch column for me is a must read every week. And Kim has been doing tremendous work on things like how the Justice Department and the FBI have been politicized, and have themselves operated sometimes outside the four walls of the Constitution. And as much as our media has gone off the rails in the last few decades, one of the core missions of media is to speak truth to power and hold them accountable. And this is something that Kim does just a tremendous job of. There's a small handful of must-watch news shows to me, and one of those is the one that runs on Saturday afternoons on Fox News, the Dow Jones Weekend Report. Kim is a regular guest there with some of her Wall Street Journal colleagues, and if you're not aware of that, it's a really great informative news and discussion show. So you could set your DVRs, and you can catch that on Saturday afternoons on Fox News. As I said, we've been trying for 2 years to get Kim here. I guess persistence is the word of the day. And we still almost failed. Her flight was delayed. She didn't get in until 3 in the morning. So but she's here, and we're delighted about that. So we have a detailed bio for Kim on the program. You all have that. I won't read that to you. Just suffice it to say that, Kim, we are so thrilled to have you here. We have board members and guests who've been saying, when are you going to get Kim Strassel to Dallas? When are you going to get Kim Strassel to Dallas? So I'm so pleased not just to have you here, but to be able to check off that box and say, we did finally get you here. Will you please join me in welcoming Kim Strassel?
Well, thank you, Tom, for that. Of course, the question in everyone's mind is, yes, she is here, but is she coherent? That is yet to be seen. It's such an honor to be asked to be part of the Hatton Sumners Distinguished Lecture Series, especially because I am so rarely described as distinguished. And in fact, if you could have seen me yesterday coming here from my home in Alaska, where it was minus 13 and I had to run out to the truck covered in animal fur to get to the airport, you would know why I am so rarely described as distinguished. Not to be cliche and start a lecture with a joke. Oh. But I never come to Texas without, in fact, relating my favorite Alaska-Texas joke. So there's a Texan and an Alaskan, and the Texan, as Texans are wont to do, and for good reason, because you live in a really great state, was busy telling the Alaskan why his state was so much better than Alaska. And he said, in every single category, we beat you. We have better sports, we have better weather, we have better food. The only place where we come in second to you, number 2, is your size. That's the only place you got anything on us. And the Alaskan looks at the Texan and says, yeah, that's right. And if you don't pipe down, we'll split ourselves in 2, and then you'll be number 3. It's the only thing we got on anybody. So my thanks to the Institute for the Policy Innovation for having me here. It obviously has been a very long time in the making. And just a little word too, I always get asked to speak to a lot of groups, including a lot of national ones based in Washington, D.C. But the ones that really fill my heart with joy, the ones that I feel a special privilege to come to, are state-based think tanks. Because for one simple reason, this is where everything happens, all right? This is the place, this is the organization where they come, they keep people informed, engaged, and active. They provoke a lot of thought, they generate new policy ideas, they keep local lawmakers on their toes, they bring people together like we're all here right now. So not only do I thank the Institute for Policy Innovation, but I also thank all of you out there in the audience for being here today and for taking part in civil discourse, which is, of course, at root the strength of this country. So some applause for everybody in the room. As Tom was noting, I work for the Wall Street Journal on its editorial page, and one reason that I absolutely love working for the editorial page is that we are very consistent for what we fight for. Some editorial pages, if you look at them, they go back and forth, they change their positions on issues, often depending on what political party is in charge or making a decision. But we at the editorial page, you can usually count on us to be consistent. We don't like taxes, whether or not Democrats introduce them or Republicans introduce them. We don't like pork, whether it's being requested by a Nancy Pelosi or a Mitch McConnell. And one reason that it's easy for us to be consistent, and this is something not everybody always knows, but is that we have a long-standing philosophy, a very short and pithy motto, which we have had for decades, and that guides everything we do. And it is free markets, free people. It used to be free markets, free men, but then folks like me started to work there, so we had to switch it up a little bit. I've actually always loved this phrase, so much so that when all three of my children were born, I had little onesies made for them in Wall Street Journal font that said, free markets, free babies, which I thought was really cute until at one point someone came up to me and asked me why I was trying to give my children away. It's the kind of person you sort of want to buy a Wall Street Journal subscription for. But think about those two aspirations, free markets and free people. Both are absolutely fundamental to liberty, to the very essence of the American project. And both are provided for, safeguarded by, that most important of our constitutional protections, the one that the founders understood must come first because it was so important in our Bill of Rights, the guarantee of free speech. Think about it. Without that guarantee, the founders understood that really nothing else mattered. Just to take an example, you could look at another right we have in that Constitution, say the right of protection against unreasonable search and seizure by government authorities. The problem is that if we see government engaging in it and we can't do anything about it, and we can't criticize it, and we can't bring it to the courts, and we can't hold those who engage in it accountable, that offense will simply continue. We can worry all we want about self-incrimination or federalism or due process or the abolishment of slavery or the right of women to vote. But again, if any of you in the audience or I or anyone in the press or anyone fears speaking out against these obvious offenses, if we fear in any way targeting by the government, whether that's getting singled out for audits or your company being chosen for special regulatory reviews or denials of license, if we fear imprisonment or the loss of our job, or even the failure to obtain a job, or any other penalty, we won't speak out. And so then all those other rights erode. At the base of everything to do with free markets and free people is the freedom of speech. Now, I will make one little exception for all the parents out there in the audience. I would hasten to throw in that this core liberty only really applies in the real world and not in people's homes. Children listening, that's all very important. My kids constantly ask me how I can go out and so passionately argue for free speech in my day job when I provide no such free speech to them. And I like to explain to them that there are, in fact, even though we don't talk about it, two very distinct forms of government in this country. The one outside the home that governs most civil society interaction, and then the one inside my home, at least, which is called an enlightened dictatorship. And as I always point out to them, that if they successfully survive my gulag, at least until they're 18, then they'll be granted all those greater liberties, okay? But it's important to remember why this matters, why so much else flows from that First Amendment, especially right now, because we have entered a very brave and scary new world when it comes to attacks on free speech. Maybe not the worst. I always hasten to say that. We have a tendency to always believe we are living in the worst possible political environment ever. In fact, we've had many, many challenges in this country. Right now, for instance, we're seeing inflation. Obviously, it's not as bad as Jimmy Carter's stagflation, although Joe Biden's given a real go at it. We've had civil rights protests, Vietnam, Korea, 2 world wars, a civil war. So far as I know, neither Janet Yellen nor her predecessor, Steve Mnuchin, have died in Weehawken in a duel lately, which is good. No senators have been beating each other over the head in the well of the Senate with canes, which had happened once, believe it or not, 1856. And we've had real challenges over the years, too, to free speech. The Sedition Act in 1798. More broadly, the suspension of habeas corpus in the Civil War. Japanese internment the McCarthy trials, more recently, the Fairness Doctrine. We've also had big changes in the way we speak over the years that have required us to rethink how we protect that right. One of them, the emergence of 24-hour cable news, or the creation of the internet and online newspapers and blogs. But I would argue that the threat we are seeing today is scary, in part because it is unprecedented. And moreover, because the people that for many years we have entrusted as gatekeepers or protectors of the First Amendment, both new ones and old ones, are fundamentally failing in their duty at the moment to safeguard free speech. When I look out there, I see two truly big threats. One of them is social media. And the weird thing about that is that social media, if you think about it, should be a godsend to free speech. Never in history have average Americans, average people just sitting at a table, had more ways to have their views heard, and by the way, instantly. In fact, sadly, sometimes instantly. We'd all be better if everyone thought just a few seconds before what went into their head came out on Twitter. But if you think about America's history of free speech in the past, it was hard at times to be heard. You know, a long time ago, you went and you had to stand on a soapbox in the public square, or you printed a pamphlet and had to figure out how to get it out. Politicians went on whistle-stop tours on trains, and even then, you could only speak to the people who lived near the tracks, okay? You called into radio hosts, you organized your community by letter or by email. But today, any thought that goes into anyone's head can instantly come out on Twitter or Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Again, in theory, that's a good thing. The problem is that increasingly, these are the forums where everyone goes. If you want to be heard, if you need to be heard, then you need to be there on social media. I've spoken to a lot of politicians about this and how much that has changed in recent years. Not so long ago, a lot of public figures refused to engage in social media. Even I didn't enjoy using social media. That's changed. If you want to get your message out, you have to be on that forum. Even we at the Wall Street Journal now, we who work there, we're required to use social media to try to pull people in to see our stories, because that is the place that so many people get their news. Increasingly, this free speech is therefore being concentrated in one area. But that also means we have an entirely new set of gatekeepers of that speech, and ones that it just so happens are neither positioned nor interested in fighting for the First Amendment. Think, in the past, the main outlets for free speech have been newspapers, TV journalists, and for most of history, they have considered themselves to have a primary duty of standing up for the First Amendment. Here, instead, we now have owners of essentially big tech companies whose bread and butter issues involve a vast number of things that have absolutely nothing to do with free speech. Complicated and thorny questions of antitrust and digital privacy and technology innovation, all of which also make them a target for Washington, D.C. politicians. So not only did they not get into this game because of a love of free speech and the First Amendment, but the owners of these firms are extremely sensitive to political pressure. They're very aware that different political parties want them to take a side in partisan issues. These are not crusading constitutionalists. These are folks who get called into hearings and told that if they don't get rid of this content or that content, that they'll end up in a political bullseye. It's really an extraordinary situation, having tech CEOs with this massive power over speech. Again, routinely getting dragged in hearings, these days often called by Democrats, who openly call for social media companies to censor their opponents. Now, they obviously don't put it that way, right? Their demands are phrased as calls for social media giants to battle disinformation, or to fact check the science, or to shut down conspiracy theories. But of course, I would just hasten to point out that doesn't make the censorship anything other than what it is, censorship. Throughout history, I would defy any of you to find me an example of a government or a dictator or autocrat who ever proudly said that they were engaged in censorship. They aren't about to admit that they are using their powers to silence opponents. They're always pretending that the squelching of information is somehow altruistic, good policy done for the benefit of the nation. But again, it doesn't make it any less corrosive. Those Washington threats have already been incredibly successful. I would wager that if you looked out, there isn't a single person in this room who doesn't know of some politician or commentator or outfit or media group, usually a conservative one, that hasn't been shut down at one point or another on social media. Nor does anyone believe anymore that the decisions to engage in that censorship are simply or purely a function of random algorithms. In fact, they're being pretty brazen about the fact that that's not what's driving a lot of this anymore. You can't get around it. Last fall, we witnessed the extraordinary sight of social media companies blocking the content of a bona fide newspaper, the New York Post, for daring to run, as it happens, a completely factual piece about a laptop belonging to Hunter Biden, or Joe Biden's son, Hunter. Some random member of Twitter's C-suite held the power to shut down one of the nation's largest media outlets, squelching a story that may well have proven consequential to the outcome of what turned out to be a very close presidential election. Similarly, I don't care your views on Donald Trump. If you like him, you hate him. It is jaw-dropping, nothing less than jaw-dropping, that social media companies have the power to join together to unilaterally silence the voice of a former president. It was equally astonishing, and I think this was the real wake-up call to many Americans, when tech companies like Amazon and Apple and Google had the power to also completely remove and shut down a free speech alternative to those social media sites, Parler. It was a sign that those companies knew no boundaries, none. Astonishing. That in case nobody understood it before, we had officially entered a brave new world of censorship, one that does require some immediate form of correction and action. The problem, of course, is that there is no easy answer. And when there is no easy answer, Washington's very good at doing nothing or making things far worse. And indeed, the ideas being discussed in DC right now about what to do about this range from extremely concerning to mind-numbingly terrifying. One of the problems is that these are private companies, and we shouldn't forget that. Does anyone, as a free marketer out there, actually believe that private companies should not have any ability to police any of the content on their site? Are we good with Twitter as a forum for pornography or calls for terrorism or for defamation? You see one of the problems here. Would you really argue that Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, simply by virtue of the fact that they are Twitter and Facebook and YouTube, should have far fewer rights to operate their product than pretty much any other company in the country? You know, a number of Republicans, even some Democrats, believe the answer is stripping companies of their liability protection, allowing them to be sued. But all that comes with all manner of unintended consequences. Yet other Republicans, we've got another idea growing in popularity, think that we should set up a system that in fact allows for the fast tracking of lawsuits calling out companies that are engaged in censorship. But how does that actually work in the court system? It's all incredibly confusing, and we don't have good answers. And of course, the absolute worst idea, the one that the Biden administration is now actively entertaining, is that we should have the bureaucrats from the federal government regulate these companies and the content on their sites. And I'm seriously not joking. This is under active consideration, having the FCC or even a new agency altogether sign off on algorithms and code of conducts at these groups. This might count as one of the most scary proposals I have ever heard come out of Washington with regards to First Amendment. Because let all of us agree on one thing. The only thing more dangerous than leaving Mark Zuckerberg to continue monitoring and managing speech in this country would be to replace him with the federal government. So that's the social media problem. I think the second huge threat we're seeing out there, it isn't a company or an entity, but it's a movement, cancel culture. This growing witch hunt-like environment in this country in which anyone who says something wrong can suddenly end up losing their reputation, their privileges, even their livelihood. And as we all know by now, when I say the wrong things, I don't mean the wrong things as defined by the only document that should in fact matter, the one Tom mentioned, the Constitution. We're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater. But those limits that we do have are very, very clear, and they're very, very few for a reason. Everything else is supposed to be on limits, even topics that are painful, controversial, and insulting. I went a couple of years ago, I wrote a book, and I ended up doing a college tour. And I ended up giving a talk, and there was a woman in the audience, a young woman who was an attendee at the university, who obviously didn't like what I had to say. And by the way, my topic of discussion was the First Amendment and free speech. And she stood up and informed me. She said, the Constitution may give you a right to engage in free speech, but it does not give you a right to offend me. I remember looking around thinking, am I at a university? And then I told her that in fact, that is the whole point. That is the whole point, is that in fact, that is what the First Amendment does. It allows us to offend each other, okay? Now, in my household, my children are not allowed to use the F word. And before you all gasp and say, well, I should certainly hope not, what I mean by that is they're not allowed to use the word fair. They've never been allowed to use the word fair since they were born. Why? Because it is a subjective term. Everyone has their own definition of what is fair. Joe Biden wants a lot of us to pay our fair share. I would imagine a lot of us who are in this room think that we're already paying something that is infinitely unfair. But you see the problem. And this is why it's also such a terrible idea to allow any movement to define what is wrong speech. That's exactly what is happening these days, though. These days, wrong is defined by some amorphous elite who daily set new markers for what is culturally acceptable, speech or not, and then changes them as they go along and apply them differently to different people depending on who they are. That's an impossible standard. It's something that should never be allowed under the Constitution. People aren't just getting shamed for their speech, which is bad enough. They're getting fired. They're getting targeted and harassed. They're losing admission places to colleges. It goes on and on. It's also terrible in that it stifles speech and debate. Cancel culture fundamentally leads to an environment of a tyranny of ideas in which one group decides what's acceptable, and even questioning that wisdom is grounds for retribution. And by the way, the left started doing this years ago on the issue of climate change. We should have all been alarmed when, again, a number of years ago, newspapers of all places began branding any scientist who didn't subscribe to the United Nations global warming consensus a climate denier. We didn't push back hard enough at that point. Now, anyone who doesn't agree with the left in the media's correct definition of everything is a denier or an offense against humanity. And this is simply not healthy. It's not healthy to live in an environment where even questioning the wisdom of tearing down historical statue brands you a racist. It's not healthy to live in a society where professors lose their jobs for teaching outside elitist orthodoxy. It's not healthy to live in a country where simply asking about the wisdom of voter ID laws earns you the title Jim Crow. And it is not healthy to live in a country where an editor of one of the biggest newspapers in the country got fired for running an op-ed by a sitting US senator. By the way, that New York Times example, again, brings me back to this question of the defenders of the First Amendment and why we're in such a terrible situation right now. Earlier, I was talking a little bit about the threat inherent in leaving a bunch of San Francisco tech geeks holding the keys to the First Amendment. But an equally large problem is that the traditional defenders of free speech are abdicating their own duties. I have been incredibly proud my entire life to work for one of the only industries that gets its own shout out in the Constitution. Freedom of the press, you know? There aren't many jobs that get mentioned in the Bill of Rights. There's not a plumber's amendment or a psych professor's amendment, okay? But there is an amendment for the press. And recently, I was always proud to work in an industry that, regardless of what you might think about their bias or their pieces or their quality, was united, long time united, in defending freedom of the speech down to the ground, but not anymore. The firing at that New York Times was a wake-up call, and you see newsrooms across the country bending and silencing contrary opinions out of fear of backlash. Not just in the media either, in all of our institutions. We have universities these days that have to set up free speech zones, which routinely refuse to host speakers who aren't in alignment with campus views. Campuses, which are meant to be the thriving center of a society's intellectual debate. We have boycotts of companies that spend money in any way in promoting good policies or free market politicians. They come under attack. They get attacked for their corporate speech rights too, and unfortunately companies that just bow to it rather than fighting back, explaining their own role in the free market. We have activist organizations that monitor who Americans give their political dollars to and target and harass them for that engagement. And equally important, we have seen a complete abdication from district attorneys and prosecutors who are supposed to be vigorously fighting against any attacks on freedom of speech. They're doing the opposite right now. They're taking an active part in the cancellation and the threats. That Department of Justice memo of recent weeks, indicating the federal government's intention to investigate and potentially prosecute parents, many of them in Virginia, who are showing up grumpy at school board meetings, that was an outright affront to the Constitution. The polar opposite of the Department of Justice's job. And don't ever let anyone tell you differently. To be very, very clear, violence or the clear threat of violence must never be tolerated. It has no place in civic discourse, and anyone who does engage in such acts should be prosecuted by the proper authorities, who, by the way, in this case, if that is actually happening, should be state and local law enforcement. Federal government has no role in this area. But as the feds well knew, as the authors of that memo knew, the vast majority of what you are seeing in these meetings is an absolute legitimate exercise of free speech. Constituents taking it to the elected. That is a hallmark of our representative democracy, a beautiful example of constituents demanding accountability from their leaders. The purpose of that memo, to be clear, was in fact to scare, to chill, to silence this form of civic engagement. So those are the threats, as well as some of the reasons for why these attacks on the First Amendment continue to escalate. And the question, of course, on all of our minds is, what do we do? One thing we absolutely must not do, or at least never automatically do, is reflexively look to the government to solve this. That's the exact wrong way to look at this, especially when it comes to things like free speech. Remember, the First Amendment, and people too often do forget this, the First Amendment exists to protect Americans from government. And we should therefore look at any claim by government, by elected officials, that they have our free speech interests at heart with enormous skepticism. Elected officials will take any opportunity to seek to give themselves more power, and the easiest way to do that is to first and foremost make it harder for people to criticize and oppose them. Take a look at the history, for instance, of all those campaign finance laws, which, by the way, some people call them campaign finance laws. I call them free speech laws, or anti-free speech laws. They were all promoted as a means of creating fairer, cleaner elections. That's never really happened. But what those laws have had the effect of doing is strengthening an entrenched incumbent class in Washington, making it harder for newcomers to break in, and making it more expensive to criticize the status quo. Is there some legislative solution in Washington that may deal in some way with big tech, may solve this somehow? Maybe. But it still needs a lot more study than it has been given up to now. And even the best solution isn't going to solve those bigger issues like cancel culture or the abdication of free speech institutions. For that, I think the immediate, more obvious answer rests in the people. Let's put aside for a minute Twitter or Parler or cancel culture. Do you really know what I think is the biggest daily threat to free speech? What chips away at it most in small ways every single week, every single month? It's apathy. We sit back and we let this happen. We sit back and accept cancellation. We sit back and continue to send those alumni checks to the universities that won't allow any diversity of viewpoint. We complain about Facebook and Twitter while on Facebook and Twitter. We sit by while our corporate officers come up with new diversity standards and privileged people training. We're appalled by the abuse of government power, but we fail to get engaged in elections. Not all you in this audience, by the way. I'm talking about us as a society as a whole. We put people in charge who might do bad things to the Constitution. It's been really inspiring to see those Virginia school board meetings. Whether you agree with what any one speaker has to say or not, they are at least saying it, even in today's environment where people are scared of speaking out. We need more of that every day. We're also now seeing people filing lawsuits. We're seeing more and more record number of people turning out in elections. We're seeing comedians like Dave Chappelle tell the critics where to go. We're seeing a handful of braver writers, by the way, and I think this deserves a shout out, on the left, going after their colleagues increasingly for abandoning free speech principles, people like Glenn Greenwald, people like Matt Taibbi. There's also one other institution that I think we should be hopefully looking to for some help here. We should have some real faith might also prove as a backstop to some of these efforts to begin pushing back, and that's the High Court. We're fortunate for the recent additions to that court and for the new signs that this court is showing some willingness to tackle tough subjects. Even as the culture around the First Amendment has worsened, the Supreme Court has proved more and more willing to stand up with some crucial decisions that expand upon free speech. A big one happened 11 years ago when Citizens United, protecting electioneering speech and reaffirming that business has a voice in public debate. A little more than 2 years ago, many of you will remember the case of Jack Phillips, owner of Masterpiece Cake Shop in Colorado, upholding his refusal to bake a cake for a gay wedding as central to his rights of free speech, free expression, and freedom of religion. Earlier this year, and by the way, this one is very near and dear to my heart, as it should be to any nonprofit out there in the country, in a case called AFP versus Bonta in California, the Supreme Court upheld donor privacy, striking down a California law that required charities and nonprofits to provide their donor names to the state government. Liberals for years have been using the threat of donor disclosure to frighten and chill the work of nonprofits and to silence speech. If you go all the way back to 1958 in a case called NAACP versus Alabama, the court understood that the ability of outside organizations to keep their memberships and donors quiet and free of government snoops was absolutely vital to freedom of association and freedom of speech. The High Court had forgotten about that ruling for a long time, but this AFP decision makes it sound as though it's remembering it. A lot more of these fights are coming down the road. At least I hope they are. Fundamentally, that's how our society, this great American experiment, that's how you retain your liberty. You think in liberty, you speak in liberty, you act in liberty. And if any government or oppressor challenges your right, you push back and but hard. The bullies, in the end, what they mostly have is indignant bravado. We, everyone in this room, have something infinitely stronger, and it's called the Constitution. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to taking some questions.